بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا محمد النبي المبعوث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. الحمد لله. In our sessions on Imam Quduri's Mukhtasar, on the section on Mu'amalat, we have reached Babu Khiyar al-Ru'ya, the option to cancel upon inspection. Right? Literally, the option to cancel upon seeing the item. The basis of a transaction is that you would buy something that you see. That would be the asl, right? But there are multiple reasons why you might buy something not having seen it, right? The item may be in storage, right, in the warehouse, so the item exists, the conditions for valid sale are fulfilled, yet for one reason or the other the item is not present. The item may have been described. You may be in a rush to buy it because there's a lot of demand for the item, right, which is a distinct possibility. Right? So let's say there's a new type of khuf and Sidi Zain only has a couple of them. So Hamza wants some and Omar wants some. So Hamza says, I want it, but you haven't seen it yet. But you want to get it or get all 100 of them. Why? Because you know there's a good market for it. So there's a number of reasons why someone may want to buy something, but they haven't seen it yet. So there is a reason to allow such a transaction, right? As long as it is sufficiently described, right, with the conditions of sufficient definition, right? That the item, we've defined its category and its type sufficiently that gross non-definition is lifted. الجهالة الفاحشة بأن يوصف بما تزول به الجهالة الفاحشة. Right? Slight non-definition still does exist, but that's dealt with by what? By having the option of cancellation. So the khufs were described, but you haven't seen them, right? They even describe the type of leather and this and that, but only when you see it can you tell if it's pleasing to you. So that element of non-definition is lifted, right, by seeing it. But before seeing it, it has to have been sold with sufficient description so that أن يوصف بما تزول به الجهالة الفاحشة, so that be described sufficiently that gross non-definition is lifted. So the Babu, he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, Imam al-Quduri rahimahullah ta'ala says, Babu khiyar al-ru'ya. And this is من إضافة المسبب إلى السبب. Right? خيار سببه يعني سببه الرؤية. Right? Right? So the cause of this khiyar is seeing something that you had previously not seen. Right? And this goes back to a hadith that has come as a mursal hadith that من اشترى شيئا لم يره فله الخيار إذا رآه. If one buys something that they have not seen, they have the option of cancelling it if they once they see it. And there's discussion about the strength of that hadith, but there's a lot of supporting evidence for this. So he says, وَمَنِ اشْتَرَى شَيْئًا لَمْ يَرَهُ فَالْبَيْعُ جَائِزٌ. If one purchases something that one hasn't seen, the sale is valid. وَلَهُ الْخِيَارُ إِذَا رَآهُ. Right? And they have the option of cancellation. Al-khiyar, right? This is the option of cancellation. They have the choice, right? But this here refers to the option. Al-khiyar refers to the option of cancellation. That arises due to seeing the thing. So he puts a number of conditions here, right? That man ishtara shay'an lam yarahu fal-bay'u jaiz, right? He says in the commentary, لكن بشرط الإشارة إليه. So the thing should have either been pointed to, أو إلى مكانه, or to its place, right? Or as and this is the position of right of some, but the critical thing is that it needs to have been defined sufficiently that gross uncertainty is lifted. فله الخيار إذا رآه وله أي للمشتري. The buyer then has the option of cancellation if they see it. Right? And they also have the option of cancelling before they see it, as the commentator makes clear. Right? Because the sale wasn't binding. Right? So let's say Zain got these 100 khufs and he gave this full description, etc., etc. Hamza bought them without seeing them. Then he checked his bank account. Like, I'm tight. Even before seeing them, you can cancel. If you have the option of cancelling upon seeing, a fortiori you have the option of cancelling before you see it. Yeah. And what is the khiyar? He says, إن شاء أخذه وإن شاء رده. If they wish, they can accept it as is, وإن شاء رده, or they can reject it. And accepting it beforehand, even if you swear by Allah and whatever, is non-binding. Because this option has been made, arises upon seeing the thing, right? Or as we'll say, upon inspecting the thing. So we'll see what is the condition. The commentator adds an important point. وَهُوَ غَيْرُ مُؤَقَّتٍ. The khiyar al-ru'ya does not have a time limit. Right? And the Dur mentions that وَهُوَ الْأَصَحْ. This is the sounder of two opinions. بَلْ يَبْقَى إِلَى أَنْ يُوجَدَ مَا يُبْطِلُهُ. But rather, it remains until something happens that would annul it. In Hashiyat, volume 4, page 65, so using the item, وَكُلِّ مَا يَدُلُّ عَلَى الرِّضَى بِهِ. Right? So using the item and anything that indicates acceptance of the item as yours would annul the khiyar al-ru'ya. I see you got a mic, you have the option of cancelling upon seeing it, but if it's not limited, right? So however, diyanatan, this is in court. Religiously, you should make it clear that you've exercised your option, right? So that you don't leave the other person hanging, especially if it's something significant. Right? And some of the ulama suggested, like Shaykh Mustafa Zarqa in Aqd al-Bay', that it should be time limited, like depending on the type of item, a month, some things maybe a year, right? So the seller is not harmed. وهو وجيه. And then he says, وَمَنْ بَاعَ مَا لَمْ يَرَهُ فَلَا خِيَارَ لَهُ. Whoever sells something they haven't seen, they have no option of cancellation. Because the text, which is the hadith that we quoted, right? And there's a number of these hadiths, right? Only affirms that for the buyer, not for the seller. How could you sell something you haven't seen? Now, this is not tricky, but you cannot sell something that's not in your possession. That you don't, right? That you do not own, right? But you could own it, and you could even have taken possession of it without having seen it yourself. How? The qabd of an agent of yours. Okay? So, see, Zayn got the shipment of khufs. So his wife said, the khufs have arrived. Okay. So she accepted the shipment. He went off and sold them, but he hasn't seen them. When he sees them, they're much better than he expected. He wants to sell them for a higher price. Does he have khiyar ru'ya as the seller? No. Right? وَمَنْ بَاعَ مَا لَمْ يَرَهُ فَلَا خِيَارَ لَهُ. Right? Now the ru'ya, right? It's called ru'ya. This is jariyun ala al-ghalib. This is the general case. Because most things are known by seeing them. Right? So Ibn Abdin mentions, وَالْمُرَادُ بِالرُّؤْيَا الْعِلْمُ بِالْمَقْصُودِ. And what's meant by seeing something is knowledge of the purpose of that thing. Because with perfume, for example, If you see the perfume, can you tell that this is good? Can you? No. You bought some sugar. Of course, like if you're dealing in wholesale items, you bought a whole bunch of sugar. Can you tell whether the sugar is good quality or not? By seeing it? No. It's known by tasting it. Right? So, so this is al-muradu bil-ru'ya al-ilmu bil-maqsood. What's meant by seeing it is knowledge of its purpose. And that's in the Hashiyah, volume 4, page 63. And also, what counts is seeing it at the time of purchase. Because if you saw it before you're considering buying it, that's not sufficient. Right? Because let's say I sold you my black shoes. Have you seen my black shoes? You probably have. Like I wear them. But have you seeing the shoes versus in general, when someone's wearing them, using them, you pass by them, is very different from the kind of seeing when you're considering buying something. Right? Right? So Ibn Abdin quotes Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, أراد بما لم يره وقت العقد لا قبله. What's meant is what you haven't seen at the time of the transaction, not before it. Okay. Then, and in the Majalla, there's item 323. That explains out, that gives a nice definition of what's meant by ru'ya. Right? It's similar to what we quoted previously, right? But it spells it out a little more. Right? That what counts is that you الرؤية الوقوف على الحال والمحل الذي يعرف به, is to know the state and the place by which something is known. Right? By which يعرف به المقصود الأصلي من البيع, where the primary purpose of the item of sale is known. So that's why he explains وإن نظر إلى وجه الصبرة أو إلى ظاهر الثوب مطويا أو إلى وجه الجارية أو إلى وجه الدابة وكفلها فلا خيار له. Right? So if one sees before buying it to the top of the subra, which is like a pile of food, or to the top of a folded garment, right? And this is a garment which the top and the bottom are the same, right? As opposed to something where, let's say, the top is plain and the bottom is embroidered or something, then you'd have to see the part that is that people would consider for the value, or to the face of the slave girl, because people are known by their faces. أو إلى وجه الدابة وكفلها, right? Um, or to the face of an animal, and what is kafaliha? What? What is the kafaliha? The rump area, right? Like the trunk, right? Because you see the face of the animal, and you see the main part of the animal. That's sufficient. Meaning, what does that exclude? The Hashia says. So this is the ajuz. So what you mentioned? What do you say? Rump? Yeah, the hips. So Ibn Abidin agrees with you actually. Right? So it's like the trunk or the ajuz, which is the lower back. Right? Because from that you know the heft of the animal. Right? Right? So he says, رؤية القوائم ليس بشرط. So seeing the legs is not a condition. Very often animals would be in a stable, for example, or they're fenced in. You can see the face, you see the trunk of the animal. That's sufficient. Right? Although there's some discussion on the legs. Okay? Because that's what's sought from in the animal. فلا خيار له. Right? Right? So Alam al-Maydani explains the asl. Right? That, and he mentions that فيكتفي برؤية ما يدل على العلم بالمقصود. It's sufficient to see that which gives you knowledge of the purpose. And there's some detail he mentions. If there's multiple things in an item of sale, right, then if they are مما يباع بالنموذج, you can say نموذج or أنموذج. It's not نموذج by, for example, you got 10 of these pens. You have to have seen all of them? No, because they're all مما لا يتفاوت أحده. Each one of them is the same. Right? You got 10 of a similar type of, the same type of pen. You saw one, that's sufficient. But if you bought 10 different things in one transaction, then you'd have khiyar for each of those things. Now, does that count as one contract or multiple contracts? That's a tricky point. That would depend on whether there's bundling discounts or not. So that we'd have to look at the custom. But for example, most things you buy from stores, do they bundle things together? No, the price is known individually. So in most standard things, the things you buy in a store, the fatwa would be on the position of the sahibain, that if the price of each is known individually, then the items would be considered separately. Right? So you don't like one item, you could return that one. Right? But the others, you could keep. You bought 10 items from Zain Mart, right? And you wanted to return just one of them. That's fine, right? Because the price of each, if the price of each was defined. But if you went to, like an old style souk, for example, or just went and negotiated with somebody, I'll buy this carpet and that thing and that thing. How much is all of this together? So he gave you a bundled price, then you can't exclude an item. Right? We discussed that before. What's called? تفرق الصفقة. Right? Or تعدد الصفقة. Right? When is each item considered separately in a transaction, or is the transaction considered a bundled transaction? Okay. Then we have a very interesting issue now. He says, وَإِنْ رَأَى صَحْنَ الدَّارِ فَلَا خِيَارَ لَهُ وَإِنْ لَمْ يُشَاهِدْ بُيُوتَهَا. If one sees the courtyard, the inner courtyard of a house, one doesn't have the option of cancelling, even if one did not see all the individual rooms. So we've talked about there's 3 levels of residence. You have the dar, which is ما يدار عليه الحيطان, that which is walled. That's the dar. Then you have al-bayt, then you have al-manzil, which is ما أعد للنزول, which is a place where that's prepared for your residence. That's a bit like an apartment, right? But it may have some supplementary things, like in the old days, like a stable maybe next to it, or in our times, a parking spot, etc. Right? That's like an apartment in our times, right? And then you have al-bayt. Al-bayt is ma yubatu fihi. A bayt is like a room. So, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. So this is the position of both Imam Abu Hanifa and the Sahibain. That adar, this is like a bayt Arabi, right? So imagine, if this door into the hall, you enter the dar. In the middle you have a courtyard, and very often there'd be like a little garden there. Some fancy ones that have a little fountain. Around the sahn, this is the inside of the house, of the dar. In our times, in Syria, they call this a bayt Arabi. You come inside, there's a courtyard, and very often the courtyard would be open roofed. So the women folk, for example, would have their privacy there. Okay? This is why they used to say that the witness of those who fly pigeons or who fly kites is not accepted. Right? And those who fly kites should be warned. Why? Because people would go on rooftops to fly kites, but it would be their excuse to look into other people's. Because people would relax their dress a little bit, especially those who are not that cautious in the courtyards of their homes, assuming no one would be seeing. And then around the courtyard you'd have rooms. These would be the buyut. So according to Imam Abu Hanifa, and this is also the position of the Sahibain, that if one sees the sahn of the dar, the courtyard of the dar, of the house, then one doesn't have the option of cancelling. Why? Even if you haven't seen the rooms. Because during the time of Abu Hanifa, the rooms were of just one type. Right? And the courtyard would indicate the quality of the residence, right? What kind of stone they use, and the rooms would be the same. Right? So this is a very rare issue in the Hanafi school, and there's treatises written on this from the Mullah family. It might be Shaykh Abu Bakr al-Mullah himself who has a treatise on this. Different people have gathered the issues where the fatwa in the Hanafi madhab is not on the position of Abu Hanifa, nor of the Sahibain, but rather on the position of Zufar. Right? And this is, Sayyid Abdul Ghani Nabulsi has a treatise on this as well, and many others. Right? On the issues where the fatwa is on the position of Zufar. Right? According to Imam Zufar, you have to see the rooms. For the khiyar ru'ya, the option of cancelling upon inspection, to be lifted. And the fatwa is on this opinion, and they say that this is a mas'ala based on aada. Right? And this is very important. Very often, legal issues are built upon certain considerations of custom. Right? So Abu Hanifa said, you don't have to see the rooms, not because there's some hadith that says you don't have to see the rooms, right? But rather due to what is the consideration for khiyar ru'ya? Al-ilmu يعني بالمقصود من المبيع, right? That you have knowledge of what's the purpose of the item of sale. That you know enough about it not to be confused. And that you would normally be satisfied now. You've seen enough to be satisfied. But what that satisfaction would be, what does it go back to? Custom, urf. And this is where, interestingly, when Mufti Rafi Usmani came to Jordan, there's an argument, I kind of triggered it, between a certain friend of mine and Sheikh Badib about why do we need to study hadith when the rulings of the Sharia have been deduced by the fuqaha? Is there any purpose beyond tabarruk and fada'il, between the barakah of reading the hadith of Rasulullah and just the virtues? Is there any legal benefit to reading hadith? And Mufti Rafi Usmani gave a very insightful answer for many reasons. And amongst them is to know what are rulings that are based on, that are textually based. That this is where Allah and His Messenger put the limit. Right? And that limit is unchangeable. And where a ruling is based on considerations of custom. So that so that may be subject to change. If that custom is not also, does not have an explicit or understood basis in the primary texts. This is an example. Yes, that's what it says in the madhab, but what is that based on? Right? But of course, this is something that goes back to the judgment of those who have sufficient standing in the madhab, not any random person. Right? So here, during the time of Imam Abu Hanifa and his sahibain, the rooms of a dar would be all the same. So if you saw the sahan, you would know the quality of the rooms. So you didn't have to have seen all the rooms. But as time passed, people, the houses became more elaborate and their quality varied and so on. So the fatwa since then has been on the position of Imam Zufar because of that. Okay. And then at the end of the section there, Imam Allam al-Maydani puts something that before the issue of Bay' al-A'ma, immediately before, he says, وَنَظَرُ وَكِيلِهِ بِالْقَبْضِ وَالشِّرَاءِ كَنَظَرِهِ. The seeing of your agent for purchase or for selling is like you're seeing the item. بِخِلَافِ رَسُولِهِ, but not your emissary, someone who's just carrying a message for you. So someone buys something on your behalf. So let's say that Sidi Yusuf wanted, let's say there's something called Turkish musk. And he made me wakil to go buy him some Turkish musk. So I went, got Turkish musk, etc. for him, came back, and he tried to say it politely, but he felt it stinks. But if I'm his agent to purchase it, that's why when you tell people to do something, you have to be very clear. Is this a request, or have you made someone an agent? Because it's a request, it's not binding. But if you make someone an agent, it's very different. And is it unrestricted agency, or is it specific? So which is we'll be seeing when we look at wakala. Because people make mistakes in it big time. I once asked someone to find me a copy of Sheikh Sulaiman al-Jamal's Hashia on the Hamziya for any price. And it's just 250 page copy. It was $300. This is like 16 years ago, 2003, I think, roughly. That was like outside of rent, that was my whole month's budget on one book. It's like a big kick in the gut. It still hurts when I think about it. But it ended up being good. Let's say I spent that much money. I made a whole bunch of copies, gave the original to Sheikh Akram, and then kept a copy. But it was binding upon me. Because I made an unrestricted agency for that matter. Right? I have a friend who gave someone, like full agency to transact on his behalf, and he wrote away this person's rights to a bunch of his property, which was totally unethical, but legally binding, because he made someone an agent on his behalf for all transactions. So we'll see that. But why is this important? Because let's say in some transactions you're selling something. Let's say you sell perfume and it ships worldwide. You don't want refunds coming in for perfume, especially like perfume that you dip and apply, like essential oils. You apply it directly to the skin. Right? Unless the buyer has smelt it. So technically what you could do is you could make clear in your transaction that the shipping agency is a wakil on behalf of the buyer. So every time you ship, you could just get them to, for a moment, can you just smell these things? Okay. And then ship it off. Right? And you could structure it in a way to take care of these things. Okay? If you're shipping like things like sugar, salt, you don't have to ship it back, and then there's all kinds of implications. So you structure your transactions accordingly, like in any other transaction, people, which is why it's mentioned in the commentaries of the Tariq al-Muhammadiyah that God-fearing traders would travel with fuqaha. Just like now when there's a big transaction going to take place, when people go to meet the other party, they take lawyers with them. They have to sign, put together contracts and stuff. And it's one of the specializations that the ulama would have, which is drafting contracts. Because contracts can be quite complicated. Than they've always been. Because they have all the relevant rights and responsibilities specified. Now, of course, in our times, contracts have been made excessively difficult, but many ulama wrote books on sample contracts, classically. right? Because there's a lot of fiqh involved in this drafting of contracts. Okay. There's a problem with the blind person. They can't see, right? So how can they ever see that which they've purchased? So that some of the fuqaha say, well, the blind person can't buy or sell themselves. They have to appoint an agent who buys and sells on their behalf. But that puts the blind person under severe disadvantage. So he says, وَبَيْعُ الْأَعْمَى وَشِرَاؤُهُ جَائِزٌ أي صحيح. The buying and the selling of a blind person is permitted, meaning it's valid. Because لأنه مكلف محتاج, because they're morally responsible and they're in need. Right? In need to fulfill their life's needs and to fulfill their masalih, their worldly and next worldly interests. وَلَهُ الْخِيَارُ إِذَا اشْتَرَى. And they have the option of cancelling when they buy, not when they sell. لَا لَوْ بَاعَ. But then, how would this khiyar be lifted? Because they can't see. وَيَسْقُطُ خِيَارُهُ بأن يجس المبيع إذا كان يعرف بالجس, by, and their option of cancelling upon inspection is lifted by, for example, feeling the animal if it's known by touch, أو بشمه إن كان يعرف بالشم, or smelling it if it's known by smell, أو بذوقه إن كان يعرف بالذوق, or by tasting if it's something known by tasting. Right? Because these convey knowledge of the maqsood. ولا يسقط. But what about something that's not known in these ways? Like what if you bought property? Right? ولا يسقط خياره في العقار حتى يوصف له. Their option of cancellation is not lifted in aqar, which is property, like land, until it is described to them. Because description can take the place of seeing in some situations, right? And this includes salam, for example, which we'll be coming to, which is the permitted forward sale. There's a specific type of forward sale that's allowed, where the item is sufficiently described. This is where some of the contemporary ulama have argued that certain items, if they are sufficiently described, then the khiyar ru'ya would be lifted. Right? Because there's, now, especially with international shipping and things being sold in large volumes, right? Especially for bulk international sales, this becomes an issue. Right? Someone got 50 tons of a certain type of sugar from China. And then it reaches them and say, I didn't like the taste. So they put some criteria for it. Amongst them that, that's why if things have known grades and standards, and that's why in most things, like even eggs, they have the grades of eggs, for example. So likewise, things that have known ma'ayir, known standards. So if something was sold at a certain standard, and it is in fact of that standard, then does the person have khiyar ru'ya? That's something where the contemporary ulama have some difference on, particularly in bulk sales. And you can see the details of that in works like Mufti Taqi's in Fiqh al-Buyu', etc. But there's basis in this on the issue of the transaction of the blind person, right? That the things that are not known, like where there's hardship, right, in lifting the khiyar ru'ya, a sufficient description may be enough. That's a precedent for when there'd be hardship on the other party, right? Someone sells precious perfume, like some oud sells for several $1,000s, right? And if you get refund, it becomes very complicated. Okay? So, anyways, but that's outside the scope of our class. And then, so here, of course, he's putting a number of miscellaneous issues at the end of the section on khiyarul ru'ya. So then he says, so this is now ahkamul fuduli, right? Ahkamul fuduli. Fadl is extra, right? So the fadil is that which is extra in the direction of good, right? 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 From that you have fadila, virtue, and fadl. Fadl and fadila, these are on the side of good. But fudul is extra on the negative side of things. So fudulul kalam is too much speech in a negative sense. Okay? So the fuduli is من يتصرف في ملك الغير بغير إذن right? Is someone who transacts in another's property, or في ملك الغير أو في حق الغير, in that which is rightfully another's, without permission. So let's say, my mic, I was traveling, and let's say, so Yusuf had the brilliant idea of selling my mic. He sold the mic to you because he figured it would look really cool on your desk. What's the ruling of this transaction? Is the transaction valid? So there's two things. The transaction itself is valid, but it is pending the permission of the owner. Why? Because there's a possibility that I really wanted to get rid of the mic. Right? But So there's a footnote here before we read the section just to appreciate it. However, الأصل في تصرف الفضول أنه محظور. The basis of the transaction of the fuduli, of the one who transacts without permission, is that it is interdicted. لأن الأصل أنه لا يجوز التصرف في ملك من غير إذن. Right? Because the basis is أنه لا يجوز التصرف في ملك الغير. It's not permitted to transact in any way in something that belongs to another without their permission. Right? This goes back one to the principle related to transaction itself. لا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل. Oh, you believe, do not consume each other's wealth in باطل ways, in false ways. إلا أن تكون تجارة عن تراض منكم, unless it be through trade on the basis of mutual agreement. So if the kufi belongs to Sidi Yusuf, for me to sell it, it's what is bay'a? مبادلة مال بمال. So Sidi Hamza gave $10, but whose mal was it? Sidi Yusuf's. Is there rida from him? If there isn't, there's a problem. And so it goes against the concept of the sale. This is why in the Shafi'i school it's not even valid. But the Hanafis did allow it. Because it could be in his benefit. He really didn't like the Kufi. He's been wanting to sell it for a while. Right? So that's why وإنما يجوز إن غلب على ظنه. رضا الأصيل. It's only permitted if one is reasonably sure that the party on whose behalf you transacted would accept, would be pleased. Would there be rida from them? An example of that, I was in Damascus at Maktabat al-Bayruti, and Ustad Mahmoud al-Bayruti stepped out on an errand. So I'm just sitting there, I was just having tea with the bookstore owner, and this wealthy Saudi or Gulf man came, because you could tell by the quality of the type of thobe he was wearing, and especially by the shoes. And he asked for a bunch of books. I was sitting right by the desk, so I said, that's over there, that's over there. I knew the bookstore like the back of my hand. How much is it? I looked at him again, guy looked loaded. So I didn't even give him a discount. It was pretty standard there to give 15 to 20% discount. I just told him the prices. They're written on the book. He didn't ask for a discount. So I wrote the names on a piece of paper, took the money, put it in the desk. So Allah Barak. It was like a couple $100 worth of books. That was like more than a week's, like probably a week's profit for, especially because I sold them without a discount. That was tasarruf al-fuduli. And I'd been asked to take care of the bookstore, right, or deal with anything. I was just sitting there drinking tea. But if I sold someone's books at the stated price, would there be a problem? No. Right? So let's say someone comes to Seekers and You're not actually sitting at the front desk. You're just walking around, someone comes, I need to pick up such and such book, and there's a price written on it. Were you asked to sell the books? No. But do you think if you sold the book for the price at the back of the book, that Umar would mind? No. That's tasarruf al-fuduli. You didn't have permission to do that. But nobody would mind because the price is known, especially an item that's already there to be sold, right? Often shopkeepers will do this for each other. Right? Someone goes off, nobody asks the shopkeeper to sell on his behalf. Someone comes, someone's looking for a donkey, and your neighbor's been trying to sell his donkey for months. So, well, the only donkey that's available for sale right now is my neighbor's donkey. It says, but I don't know anything about the donkey. You check it out. The guy sees the donkey, says, looks good to me. Says, it's a bit cranky. You want to ride it a little bit? Guy rides it, says, love the donkey. Buys the donkey. Ahlan wa sahlan, right? Donkey's owner comes, says, where's my donkey? Says, I sold it. He comes, gives you a big hug and kiss. But the sale would be pending his approval. If he doesn't approve, you have to go find the guy who bought the donkey and say, sorry, please give it back. Right? So this is tasarruf al-fuduli. The basis is don't do that. Because one, it goes against the concept of taradi. And number two, right, the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يحل مال امرئ مسلم إلا بطيب نفس منه. Right? The property of a Muslim is not permitted except with their willful agreement. With their willful agreement. كل المسلم على المسلم حرام. Right? Everything of a Muslim is inviolable for another Muslim. دمه وماله وعرضه. Their life, their property, would be, and their good name. So it's inviolable. You cannot transact in it and you cannot use it. Right? Which is why this is an important principle. لا يجوز التصرف في ملك الغير من غير إذن أو ولاية. And some say أو وكالة. But the wakala is a type of idhn. Right? لا يجوز التصرف في ملك الغير. It's not permitted to transact in the property of another without either permission, idhn, or wilaya, or without authority. Like you are the guardian, the parent or the guardian or the custodian, but within the limits of guardianship that apply to you. Or wakala, or agency. Someone's made you an agent. Again, within the limits of agency. Like an employee is an agent, but within the limits of agency. Okay, so that's a little bit of background. So he says, وَمَنْ بَاعَ مِلْكَ غَيْرِهِ فَالْمَالِكُ بِالْخِيَارِ. Whoever sells the property of another, then the owner of that which was sold has the option of has the option of cancellation. إِنْ شَاءَ أَجَازَ الْبَيْعَ. If they wish, they would validate the sale. وَإِنْ شَاءَ فَسَخ. And if they wish, they can cancel it, annul the sale. Now, here, so this is called بيع الفضولي, and the hukum of the بيع الفضولي is البيع صحيح موقوف. The transaction is valid, but it is suspended. A موقوف على إذن المالك. It's suspended pending the permission of the owner. وله الإجازة إذا كان المعقود عليه باقيا. And they have the permission of validating the sale as long as the item remains. So what happens? If the item gets destroyed, then technically the fuduli would have to compensate for it, right? وَالْمُتَعَاقِدَانِ بِحَالِهِمَا, and the two transacting parties remain. So this is something only to do when you are when you're sure that the other party would approve. I once had Sheikh Nuh Keller enter into a Aqd Fuduli on my behalf, which BBC contacted Sheikh Nuh, this is like 2000, 2001, to write an article about the Sharia. Sheikh Nuh was in the midst of a project, he couldn't do it. So we walked out of the masjid together, and he said, I acted on the Hanafi school this morning. Okay. Says, I entered into Aqd Fuduli on your behalf, following your madhab. Because basically he agreed with BBC that someone would write the article and say, negotiated a price for BBC never paid me, by the way. They owe me $200. Never asked for it. So there's an article about the Sharia. I didn't really want to write it either, but I did it. I could have not agreed, like legally, not adab-wise. And that's Aqd Fuduli as well. That's the Aqd Fuduli applies to bay', it also applies to ijar. Right? Okay. ومن رأى أحد الثوبين فاشتراهما ثم رأى الآخر جاز له أن يردهما. If one sees one of two garments, and these are متفاوتين, right? So there's two conditions here. They're متفاوت. If one sees one of two garments, and the two garments are different from each other, and في عقد واحد, right? And they're in one transaction, in one contract, right? One saw one of the garments but not the other, فله جاز له أن يردهما. One has the right of returning both of them. Why? Because this is according to Abu Hanifa. Because according to Imam Abu Hanifa, إنما تتعدد الصفقة بتعدد الإيجاب والقبول. Right? According to Imam Abu Hanifa, when multiple things are bought and sold together, they're only considered separate transactions if there's a separate offer and acceptance for each. وعندهما بتفصيل الثمن. And according to the Sahibain, if the price of each is mentioned separately. So this is according to Imam Abu Hanifa. وَمَنْ مَاتَ وَلَهُ خِيَارُ الرُّؤْيَا بَطَلَ خِيَارُهُ. Whoever dies and they had the option of cancellation upon inspection, خِيَارُ الرُّؤْيَا, their khiyar is annulled. Why? Because this is based simply on judgment. Right? Like khiyar ru'ya, like khiyar shart. It's not inherited. As opposed to khiyar al-aib. Because that's a right relating to the preservation of a right. Not simply personal judgment. Because you can't transfer personal judgment. Personal judgment is not inherited, but rights are inherited. Right? If they have material consequence, such as defects, which we'll be seeing next. Okay. And then he says, وَمَنْ رَأَى شَيْئًا ثُمَّ اشْتَرَاهُ بَعْدَ مُدَّةٍ. If one's, and this is here, this is why one has to be careful with mutun. He says, let's read what the matan says first, and we'll, right? وَمَنْ رَأَى شَيْئًا, whoever sees something, ثُمَّ اشْتَرَاهُ بَعْدَ مُدَّةٍ, then they buy it after some time. فَإِنْ كَانَ عَلَى الصِّفَةِ الَّتِي رَآهُ فَلَا خِيَارَ لَهُ. If it is as it was when he saw it, he has no option of cancellation upon inspection. وَإِنْ كَانَ مُتَغَيِّرًا فَلَهُ الْخِيَارُ. But if it's changed, then they have the option of cancelling. The key condition here is وَمَنْ رَأَى شَيْئًا قَاصِدًا لِشِرَائِهِ. Do you guys have that in the matan? Okay, good. Okay, قاصدا لشرائه, right? Right? And this is actually in Tanwir al-Absar, he added this in the matan itself. وَلَوْ اشْتَرَى مَا رَأَى قَاصِدًا لِشِرَائِهِ. If you purchase something later, having seen it before with the intent of purchase. How? So, Sidi Yusuf's kufis were all getting sold because he bought these really amazing kufis from Singapore. So, he's only left with one kufi. So, he got a big shipment of kufis and he got permission to have a storefront. So, he hired Zubair to sell his kufis. Yeah? Right? So there's a storefront. Zubair comes to Sidi Hamza, who's working limited hours, selling Welsh kufis. Okay? So he came, saw the kufi, asked about the price. So this is for the purpose of transaction. He saw it. Then days later, he purchased 5 of those kufis. And it's the same thing that he saw before with the intent of purchase. He has no khiyar. But the qasdu shira is important. And of course, when something is presented, like it's on display for sale, it's shown on the basis of selling it. The indication being that the price is either displayed or mentioned. And that's the 2 indicators of qasdu shira, right? That something is on display for selling, or when it's shown, the price is mentioned. Then you have no option of, khiyar ru'ya, because if it's the same thing, as opposed to, like, don't look towards Shaykh Yusuf. Have you noticed what kind of kufi he's wearing? Could you describe it? But you've greeted him today, have you not? So you saw it. So if he sold it to you, could he then say, no? But then you didn't like it. That's tough. No. Because you saw it, but you didn't pay attention to it. So this condition is very important. And here, and there's another condition which is that when buying, you knew that this is what you saw previously. So there's 2 conditions, right? One is that you saw it first time with the intention of, with the purpose of buying. And when you did buy it, you knew that this is what you purchased. This is what you saw previously. And this is mentioned in Hashit ibn Abdin, volume 4, page 69. And it's discussed in the Majalla, item 332. And in the commentary, it mentions هَهُنَا قَيْدَانِ احترازيان. Right, and these two are mentioned. Inshallah, we'll take a photo. We'll take a picture of these, but you should probably copy it from the Sharh al-Majalla, because I think my pen. I don't know what was going on with my pen when I wrote these notes. They're pretty sad. Okay, so the two conditions. One is when you first saw it, you saw it with the intent of purchase. The sign of the intent of purchase. The item was on display with the price listed, or it was shown to you with the price mentioned, right? Because if you go to a store and you saw something with the price on display, I said, I didn't have the intent of purchase, then why are you shopping, right? That's not believed. I'm just admiring the beauty of the item on display, right? That's not accepted. And the other is when you purchased it, you knew that it's the same item. Okay, so that's khiyarul ru'ya. Then we have khiyarul aib, the option of cancelling due to defects. So we'll continue from here. Bidhnillahi ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa nabina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.